The Aurelia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the September installment of the History Speaker Series. We have a wonderful presentation for you this evening. My name is Lindsay. I'm the History Coordinator at OMAH. And as well, of course, we have Chris Newton, who it is now my pleasure to get to introduce. In 2020, Mariposa Arts Theatre, who is the topic of the talk this evening, celebrated their 50th anniversary. But that, of course, did not have much celebration due to a certain global pandemic. So now in 2023, Matt is finally able to celebrate their milestone anniversary. Chris has been looking forward to sharing the stories and his memories of Matt. And it's such a wonderful organization that has contributed so much to our community throughout the decades. Now, Chris and his family moved to Aurelia in 1992. And soon after arrival, Chris and his wife, Linda, joined Mariposa Arts Theatre. And for the past 31 years, Chris has been involved in approximately 50 productions with Matt, both on and off stage, and has been a member of the Matt board. In September 2019, Chris was the recipient of the MAT Hall of Fame Award due to his many contributions. So we're so fortunate to have Chris with us here to share his firsthand knowledge and his expertise of such a brilliant organization within our community.
Thank you very much, and to OMAH for having us as part of the speaker series. And welcome to those who are joining us this evening. And I want to give special thanks to the many who assisted me with this presentation. Now, how did we, the Newton family, get involved with what is commonly referred to as MAT? Well, as Lindsay indicated, we moved to Aurelia in 1992 as part of the OPP General Headquarters relocation. And word got out that a cello had moved to town. So Linda received a call from Mayumi Kumagai to see if she'd be interested in being a part of the orchestra for Matt's fall production of Fiddler on the Roof. And she joined the orchestra, and here we are with Blair Bailey at the center as the musical director, sitting beside Rowena Robinson, and many participants with that orchestra are in this picture as well. So she asked if there were any parts still available for a certain ham actor who had had some theatrical experience in the past. Well, I auditioned, and the director, Michael Clipperton, cast me as the constable. Now, in the past with Aurelia, live theater has been a part of Aurelia's fabric for a long, long time. I mean, going back to the Stephen Leacock years, through both the high schools and the elementary schools, the Park Street Players under the direction of Ted Duff. And there was also a theater group called the Aurelia Theater Guild that ran in the 1960s. And here, in the picture on the right-hand side, you see a picture of the woman in the bottom right. That's Doreen Hodson, now known as Kelly. And she was very involved with that group, and soon after became a valued member of MAT. And in fact, later this month, she's going to be inducted into our Hall of Fame. And I want to thank Doreen for the information about the Aurelia Theater Guild. The Aurelia Opera House was once considered one of the grandest opera houses north of Toronto. However, in the 1960s, it was considered by some to be a white elephant. It was hardly ever used anymore. It was in disrepair, and there was even some talk of tearing it down. Well, also at the time when cities were becoming influenced by the heritage preservation movement, It was the majority of the council's wish at the time to increase its usage and possibly restore the Opera House to its former glory. So Don Shave, who was the newly named director of the Orillia Recreation Commission, created a new Orillia Arts Council. And in April of 1970, he invited representatives from theater, music, dance, and art to attend a meeting. Well, 17 people showed up, and they attended at the Artists' Workshop, which was above the old Eaton's Order Store. And out of that, in June of 1970, Jackson Spear hosted a meeting at the Opera House for those interested in forming a community theater group. Well, 25 people attended, and thus began Mariposa Arts Theater. And it was decided at that time that they would do a fall show. So the Opera House needed some cleaning up. So here we have Operation Cleanup, and it started in July of 1970. And Carol Kent, Jim Jamison, and Faye Shackle did some facelifting to the dressing rooms, the hallways, and the stage. And also there had to be a lot of repairs done to the seats. They were preparing for the fall production of On Monday Next by Philip King. Now here's a picture of the cast surrounding the director, Nan Casada. And this was at the actual dress rehearsal. Now, missing from this picture is George Smith, and George was in the cast. And I want to thank George for the hours he spent at the library scrolling through a microfiche machine, gathering materials on the beginning of Matt. In this picture is also Bob and Polly Burns, who went on to become longtime members with Matt. Now, On Monday Next opened Thursday, October the 17th, 1970. This was actually, for those who remember those days, was actually one day after Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act regarding the FLQ crisis in Quebec. Now, you'll note the prices, $1.50 and $1. It was a 3-act comedy around the trials and tribulations of rehearsing and mounting a play, and it had minimal set, which was ideal for Matt at the time. They rehearsed at the Opera House. There was minimal lighting available. They had to actually borrow spotlights and create their own footlights. Well, apparently it ran fairly smoothly, but George Smith, who played the author, remembers getting knocked out briefly. Apparently he was hit in the head by a large beanbag counterweight that was supposed to hit him in the chest. And there was a positive review in the Packet and Times. Quote, quite well acted by performers, some of whom were appearing on stage for the first time in their lives. The first musical we did, Camelot, and this was at the Pavilion, directed by Jackson Spear, and I'm told that it was actually a concert version. Now, Club Pavilion is no longer there, but it was at the bottom of Bay Street, across from Couchiching Beach. The first musical that we did at the Opera House was The Sound of Music, directed by Jackson Spear. Now, he thought it was a safe show to do until he overheard a woman after the show say, if I'd known it was about Catholics, I wouldn't have come. Well, it must have been quite a sight when several nuns gathered behind the Opera House on the Saturday morning of the costume parade, smoking and carrying on, much to the surprise of onlookers from the farmers' market. There was a fog machine used, however, somewhat liberally, as it enveloped Betty Ann Sargent on stage and completely filled the orchestra pit. Fred Larson was Captain Von Trapp, Doris Kehoe as Maria, and Elizabeth Reed as Mother Abbess. And I want to have special thanks to Geraldine Barnard for her thorough and well-organized scrapbooks that she lent to me, talking about the 1970s, and also to the late Lois Deventer, whose scrapbooks have been donated to Matt. For this show, Mildred Isom did the costumes, 200 costumes. Mildred owned a dress shop in town, and she also did several other shows after that. The orchestra, led by Charles Woodrow. Now, it was 34 years later that we did The Sound of Music again. This time, David Jeffries was Von Trapp, Aaron Hill as Maria, and Rita Whiston as the Mother Abbess. And here on the right is a picture of Linda Lewis, who was the musical director. And here she is playing along with her husband, Jim, and stepson, Steve Lewis. And this was directed by Pam Craig and Kevin Scarf. Now, Guides and Dolls, we have done that 3 times. The first time in 1972 was held at the PAV and directed by Jackson Spear. And in the picture, you'll notice that there's some crap shooters, including a 14-year-old Blair Bailey, who was the second from the right in the top part of the picture. And down below, we see Ken Brown as Nicely, and surrounded by Suzanne and Betty Ann Sargent. Well, this show was so popular that it was asked to perform at the opening of the refurbished Gravenhurst Opera House in September of 1972. 1991 production, directed by Michael Clipperton. Here's a picture of Ian Mundy carrying Craig Maltby, and over on the right is a picture of the Havana scene. 2011, this production was directed by Phyllis Johnson. Now, we have no understudies, and unfortunately, an actor became quite ill prior to the Saturday night performance and actually had to be hospitalized. So Phyllis gathered everyone together. Keenan Howell moved up from the chorus, delivered his lines with a script and a newspaper, and amazingly, Mike Sadie, who happened to know one of the songs, stepped in and delivered a faultless performance. 1972 and 73, Matt, for both those summers, there was a cooperative theater company that included the York University students and members of Matt. Now, in 1973, there was some controversy over the name. You see, Matt received a letter from a law firm representing the Mariposa Folk Festival. Well, apparently there were some ads noticed in out-of-town cities referring to the group as the Mariposa Festival. And here's a picture of the group from 1973, including some Matt members and York University students. You can't take it with you. We done that twice, 1973 and 2012. The 1973 production was directed by Jackson Spear, the 2012 by Phyllis Johnson. Now, you'll notice over on the right, it says Bats. Bat takes a curtain call. Well, apparently, I mean, we've had bat issues at the Opera House for a number of years, but in this case, perfect timing came out when the curtain call was taking place. We purchased our own lighting in 1973, and here's Harold Kehoe at the top, Fred Isom at the bottom, setting the lights up for this show at the Opera House. We also, at this time, helped to pay for the air conditioning in the Opera House. 1974, South Pacific. This was directed by David Rummerfield. Here's Ken Brown as Billis, Jim Barnett as Emile, and Mary Jo Masterson as Nellie. In the year 2000, we did South Pacific again, directed by Wayne Noble. And here we have Dave Graham and Rebecca Towns, Michael Clark and Rebecca Towns. And notice the gorgeous scenery in the background, done by Joanna McEwen. 1975 was the first time we did Man of La Mancha. Here's Jim Barnett in full makeup and having it applied by Margaret Ross. Over on the right-hand picture, Mary Jo Masterson played Aldonza. Now, in 1997, we did Man of La Mancha again, this time with John Jeffries as Don Quixote. Now, Jim Barnett was also in this show in the chorus, and Marilyn Gregory played Aldonza. What a wonderful picture over on the right side of John and Jim. Now, we had a real coup in 1975. Alan Lund. Jackson Spear had a connection with Mr. Lund, and he was available to do the show. So he agreed to direct Kiss Me Kate. Now, Alan Lund was a dancer, choreographer, and director for 50 years, and he was also the founder of the Charlottetown Festival. And here he is leading a choreography rehearsal. Over on his shoulder is a picture of Ted Duff. Now, unfortunately, we could only use the lower part of the theater at that time, as the balcony had to be shut down to unsafe fire escapes. Now, notice the beautiful costumes, the sets, and the lighting. Set designer was Gary Branstad. The costumes, again, Mildred Isom. The lighting done by her son, Steve Isom. And Steve has gone on to a very successful career as a lighting designer in Canada. Arsenic and Old Lace, 1976, directed by Ted Duff. And The Spinsters, played by Doreen Hodson, Kelly, and Ruth Van Peckham. Ken Brown was in this production. Now, in 2005, the one directed by Phyllis Johnson over on the right, Ken Brown was in that again, and he played Lieutenant Rooney, the same role he played approximately 60 years before when he was attending university. We've done Fiddler on the Roof 3 times, 1976, 1992, and 2009. And here's a picture of Ken Atkinson leading the choreography. Jackson Spear directed this production. Alan Lund was going to, but he couldn't make it that year, and Jackson took over. The 92 production was directed by Michael Clipperton, and the 2009 production by Wayne Noble. Now, whoops, down went the bed. Fortunately, this was at a dress rehearsal. And here we see Harry Speed and Geraldine Barnard. See, during the rehearsal, the bed collapsed, but Doreen Kelly, or Hodson, she happened to have a camera backstage, which is incredible in those days, and snapped this picture. Here's a picture of Harry Speed as Tevye. The matchmaker scene, Sheila Beausoleil, Tammy Gilbank, and Laurie Graham. Now, several of our shows have been adjudicated over the years by ATCO. Not all, but some. And in this case, Matt won 6 out of the 9 awards while competing against 10 other musicals. And here's the winners. Now, Fred Isom wasn't available to have the picture taken. Unfortunately, that year, tragedy struck Matt when the young Sean Robinson was killed in a motor vehicle collision. And this was a great tragedy to Matt and to the overall community of Orillia. He was an up-and-coming member, he was actually the fiddler in the Fiddler on the Roof production and was part of the Park Street Players. And Cecil Kay, he played the constable in that production. He was seriously injured. Sinbad, 1997. This was the first pantomime that we'd done. It was directed by Fred Isom. Sinbad's mother was played by George Smith. And here you see a picture of Jim Barnett playing Man of the Sea. Now, we did some Pops concerts during the 1970s, 1974 and 1977, led by Charles Montroy. Jim Middleton, who you see in the right-hand picture at the bottom, he was the concert master for many, many years. 1977, Carousel, Ron Payne and Sheila Beausoleil. They actually became a real couple soon after this show, and they are going to be appearing in our 50th anniversary show. This was directed by Jackson Spear. You know, our sets had to be built at that time at the old Creamery building on Coldwater Road. Now, in 1978, Matt was in financial crisis and almost became insolvent. Some members left that year as they wanted to move theater in a different direction and formed the Galaxy 2 Theater Company that lasted for a short time. However, the decade ended in better financial shape with good-sized audiences for 2 popular musicals at the time. Annie Get Your Gun, starring Geraldine Barnard as Annie and John Jeffries as Frank Butler. And this was directed by Ron Payne. And over on the right, you see a number of shows that we showed during the 1970s. The other musical was The Fantastics, directed by Geraldine Barnard. Now, over on the left, you see the gentleman on the very left in that picture. It's Cam Maltby. And Cam is no longer with us. However, he is going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame in September as well. And this was the last show that we did in the 1970s. The 1980s opened, and one of the shows that helped open that decade was Harvey, directed by Doreen Hodson Kelly, with Jim Foster in the lead. Now, families have always been a big part of Matt. several families over the years. And it's one of the beauties of Mariposa art. And in this case, with Plaza Suite in 1978, we actually have 3 generations in that picture. This show is being directed by Doreen Hodgson, and in it, her mother, her 2 children, her son-in-law, and her niece. Now, we Exit the Body was another family affair, as it says, and actually Christine Peterson and Doreen, her mother, acted in the same show. Christine has been in a number of shows and had the lead in Wait Until Dark in 1979. This show was directed by Polly Burns. And as far as 3 generation families we have, with the Maltbys and the Jeffreys. Now, the 3 members of the Jeffreys from the different generations are going to be appearing in our 50th anniversary show as well. Gilbert and Sullivan, we did 2 shows. 1982, The Mikado. 1983, The Pirates of Penzance. Now, Lois Deventer, I brought her up because Lois was on our board for 14 years, and 9 straight years she went without missing a meeting. And much of the correspondence generated by Matt during her years was over her signature. And here's a list of the things that she did over those years. Death of a Salesman, famous play, directed by Polly Burns, done in 1984 with Gord Sherman and Peggy Long. Now, unfortunately, 1985, Jackson Spear passed away at the age of 68. Jackson was once the Aurelia Citizen of the Year because of the work he did with Matt. So there was a production held at the Opera House in his honor. 400 people attended. And it was directed by Gary Branstad. And a quote from Betty Ann Sargent: "When we were on stage, we could feel the floor shake, and all felt that he was with us." And here's a picture of Gary backstage. He came back from Kitchener to produce this show. And here he is with Jackson's daughters, Heather and Chris. Now, in 1985, we did Damn Yankees. Wonderful, artistically a very successful show. However, due to cost overruns, 1985, it lost $4,000, as have other shows over the years. You see, at the time, the only source of income for Matt was from our productions, and we basically lived paycheck to paycheck. So in 1986, Matt, again, was in financial crisis, and they actually had a special meeting to discuss the viability of Matt continuing as a theater group. Well, fortunately, the decade ended with Matt being in better financial shape with the mounting of 2 popular musicals and a certain spring review. Oh, Really? Oh, Really? It ran for 15 seasons. And here's a picture of the original cast. And it actually kept us in the black for some seasons, especially during the early 1990s when some of our shows lost money. It was a lighthearted spoofing, especially of local events and personalities, and it was held at various locations, however, mostly at the Legion. And here's a couple of more pictures of casts from the years. Now, they had some famous skits, one of them being The Royal Family. And here we see Stu Finlayson, Deb Halbert, Bill Price, and Linda Lewis playing the family. And over on the right, we see the Reverend J. Paul Humble, played by Jim Foster, and his loyal choir, soliciting funds from his loyal followers. And here's a picture of the guys who appeared in most years. Here's Jim playing Mayor John Palmer. Now, the Mayor John Palmer, he was 7 feet tall, okay? And Jim stood on a chair to play the part. And one night he worked the pipe so hard that it caught his paperwork on fire. And there was also another evening when John Palmer was in attendance. Well, he gave Jim a standing ovation and had everyone else get up and give a standing ovation as well. Over on the right is a choreography rehearsal under the direction of Debbie Drum. Shirley Dunlop, she was the musical director for most of the years, and Bob Luke provided the intermission entertainment with his band. And Myra Luke, she produced all of the shows. Ken and Millie Brown. I love the picture of the two of them. They were involved in every show. And below we have a picture of the cast party. Now, I mentioned two musicals that helped to turn things around. The first one was The Wizard of Oz, directed by Sandra Atkinson. And here's a picture of Molly Atkinson and Jenny Rayfield, who shared the role of Dorothy. Now, Molly, she's gone on to star in series such as the Road to Avonlea movies and is presently a director at the Shaw Festival. Here's a rehearsal with the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, and the Tin Man, with the Ted Duff and Sud Sullivan on the left. And here they are in costume, off to see the wizard. Now, the next year, we did Oliver, again, directed by Sandra Atkinson. And as you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, we had lots of kids, okay? Now, apparently, they got a little carried away with graffiti backstage, and Matt had to pay for the repairs. And here's a picture of Yvonne Lacey on the right. Yvonne Lacey, she was the president for many years with Matt. She produced, directed, and acted in numerous shows. Backstage help trying to keep the kids under control. We see Bob Burns, Will Gill, Jan Livingston, Dave Austin, his son Tim, Phyllis Johnson, and Jim Holton. Jim built many of our sets during those years. Anything Goes opened in 1990, directed by Mary Hasselstein. Look at the beautiful costumes. And the band. And over on the right is Mary. I love this picture of Mary. 1995, we did Brigadoon, starring Colleen Gradanis, Mike McVitie. Again, look at the beautiful scenery created by Joanna McHugh. And over on the right, we have Bob Burns, who was the stage manager, Ron Atkinson, who was in it, and our daughter, Megan Newton, helping to keep track of the script. The Diary of Anna Frank, we have done twice. 1995, directed by Wayne Noble. 2019, directed by Ron Payne. You know, 1995, we could only run this show for 4 performances. And look at the work that was done on that particular set. And it had to be torn down after only 1 week. Now, the backstage for this show, we had Diane Richardson and Susan Canfield. This was the year that both of these women started with Matt, and they have been mainstays ever since. Diane has been our treasurer since 2004 and has been involved in so many other ways. Susan, she's done props for most of our shows since 1995. And both of them will actually say that they never, ever want to be caught on stage, though. So they have put a nice presentation together at the Aurelia Library, along with some other people, saying you must go and see it. It's had costumes and props, and they actually have a timeline of putting a production on. Ray Story. Ray Story acted in a few Matt productions in his youth. He played Sancho in the 1975 production of Man of La Mancha. He was also part of the Park Street Players. He attended the National Theatre School, and he has become an award-winning writer for theater and television, particularly the Avonlea series. Well, Matt's done 2 of his shows, both of them directed by Sandra Atkinson, Dreamland, and he came to see one of those shows, and The Country Chorale. The King and I, we've done that twice. 1973, directed by Jackson Spear with David Rummerfield as the King. And in 1996, this production was directed by Sandra Atkinson. The musical director was Blair Bailey and Rob Townsend as the King. Look at the size of the cast and the orchestra. There's 80 people in this picture. And our members, they come from various backgrounds, okay? Right from students up to professionals. However, I must say that most come from the teaching profession. Meet me in St. Louis. We did that in 1998. Clang, clang, clang went the trolley. This trolley is made out of sheet metal, and it was made by Chuck Mugford and his students at a Barrie High School. Brian Helbet has also had his students assist Matt with various things as well. Now, the studio theater. We had a lot of financial problems arising from the cost of running comedies and dramas in the more expensive upstairs theater. And we often barely broke even and actually quite often lost money. Well, after the council chambers moved from the Opera House to the Tudhope building in 1997, the former council chamber was converted into the intimate studio theater. And this allowed us to run our comedies and dramas for 2 weeks and to also offer excellent productions of lesser known plays. Now, Matt's first show in the studio theater was called And Then There Were None. And this was directed by Polly Burns, and Bob Burns was in the cast. And this is quite fitting considering that they were both in Matt's very first show in the Opera House in 1970. Now, it took some getting used to having the audience so close, especially when you had long-legged attendees occupying the front row. And for this production, we actually had an audience member walk onto the set during the intermission to get a better look at what was written on the wall above the mantel. And I also want to say this was the first show reviewed by John Schwartz, who has continued reviewing our shows right up to this time. Now, Saltwater Moon, Leaving Home. These were 2 shows from the Mercer trilogy written by the Canadian Newfoundlander David French. Saltwater was directed by Bev Totten, former president with Matt, and Leaving Home was directed by Michael Clipperton, and here you see Linda Lewis, John Bleasby, Angela Collins, and Philip Cooper. Film night came to Orillia in 1996. Phil Hull, whose picture you see here, and a friend attended a film that was part of the film circuit in Barrie. He presented the idea to the board as a fundraiser for a building fund and other ways to support Matt. Well, in April of 1996, the first film was shown, Margaret's Museum, at the Orillia Cinema on Colburn Street. And we later, in 2006, moved to the Galaxy Theatre. The film night has had 313 films over 27 years. And the last season prior to the pandemic, over 5,000 people attended the films that year. And it has contributed significantly to Matt's financial well-being. The committee was overseen by Phil until his passing in 2012. He passed the baton on to Ruth Watt and her dedicated film night committee. Ruth has also been a longtime board member and producer of numerous shows with Matt. And quite simply put, without film night, we would not have what our group has today. 1999, we did Rough Crossing, written by Tom Stoppard, directed by Wayne Noble. Now, I just want to say, if you supposedly see alcoholic drinks on stage, it's usually supposed to be something other than alcohol. Now, as the drunken ship steward in Rough Crossing, I had to drink so much iced tea, it took me months to even stand the thought of it, as Susan Canfield, who did the props, can attest. Polly Burns was the producer of this show. She's in the picture above Wayne Noble, who's cutting the cake. And I also want to mention that a valued member of Matt at the time is Mo Kluche. And you see Mo over third from the right. Mo was worked at the Opera House at the time, when he left, he eventually became a Matt member. Unfortunately, he passed away at a far too young age. Now, we've continued to work very closely with Wendy Fairburn and Claude Lebrec and other staff members at the Opera House. Okay, in the fall of 1987, Matt was forced to cancel their one and only show, other than because of COVID. And that's because we didn't have enough men come out. There were only 3 men for 7 male parts. Now, in 1999, Yvonne Lacey, she originally held auditions for Night of the Iguana. Again, not enough men. No problem. She decided to do Steel Magnolias with 6 women, Arlene Decker, Mary Lou Amos, Bev Totten, Patty Scott, Sandra Atkinson, and Janet Lynn Durnford. In 2023, we did Steel Magnolias again, directed by Stevie Baker. The year 2000 opened with Narnia, and this was directed by Polly Burns. Notice the beautiful scenery on the left-hand side and lighting. And this was done by Joanna McEwen. And over on the right, we see Josh Helbett and Michael Clark, the child, and Mike played Aslan. Shamira Dion. Shamira Dion came to Matt in 1997, and she's a trained professional in the makeup. And although we had excellent makeup people prior to this, she took it to another level and did most of our shows until her sudden passing in the year 2020. Over on the right, you see some of her work. Michael Clark as Aslan and Colleen Gradanis as the White Witch in Narnia. And here we see Rita Whiston, Angela Mundy, Holly Patton, and Aaron Hill during The Sound of Music. Now, 12 Angry Jurors, we did that in the year 2001. It was directed by Wayne Noble, and it was perfectly suited for the studio theater because it all took place in real time, hour and a half, no intermission. The audience felt like they were part of the jury room. And it was interesting that we had a mix of men and women for this. Instead of being 12 angry men, it was 12 angry jurors. Cabaret in 2003, again, directed by Wayne Noble. This was definitely not The Sound of Music. Starred Jason Allen as the MC and Christina Bosco as Sally Bowles. Now, for 35 years, we had to change our storage facility several times. And the picture you see here is our first workshop and storage building on Peter Street. Now, we had several issues with rent, water damage, landlord disagreements, moldy costumes, room to build. And during one move, we discovered that we had an unwanted pet, a rat. And we also had problems trying to find rehearsal space. It was a huge issue. Schools became expensive, people's homes, the Orser Arena, McKinnell Square. So it was decided that it was time to get our own place. Now, Matt had always wanted our own building, but the finances and someone to lead the initiative was not there. And here's a quote from Polly Burns back in 1987. I have a dream that Mariposa Arts will have its own building, a place where plays can be staged and where we can store memorabilia and equipment. Well, under the leadership of Phil Hull and others, including Bob Burns and Jim Lewis, the reality of a home began to take shape. The dig began in 2003, and we purchased a property at 12 Brammer Drive. There was a building fund organized by Linda Crawford and Phil Hull. The architect was Rod Young, and Max Durnford was the original general contractor. And here's a picture. A lot of the work was done by volunteers and also professionals. And here's Phil taking a theatrical pose with a saw. Well, on the right, we moved into this to the workshop from the Queen Street location in 2005. And down on the bottom right, you see a picture of Diane Richardson, who oversaw the finances. Here we are approaching the front of 12 Brammer Drive. It's a 5,000 square foot building, basically divided into a rehearsal hall on the right and a workshop area on the left. And as the money became available, we made improvements such as the parking lot, wheelchair accessible ramp, air conditioning, and building a new kitchen. Here we go into the front entranceway, and this is the rehearsal hall named in Phil's honor. And props set up by Susan. And then over on the left-hand side, you'll see our plaque for the Mariposa Hall of Fame, entering into a huge workshop, lots of machinery, sets, props, all stored in this area. Now upstairs, we have our costume area. This was organized by Phyllis Johnson and Brenda Kasparowicz, amongst others, and it took a lot of organizing, as you can see by the number of costumes in this space. I think they really need more room than that. And entering the rehearsal hall. Here we have a nice little entrance, and it's set up for the cabaret that we held this past spring. This allows us to rehearse on the actual set for several weeks prior to a show, rather than the old days when we used to have to move into the opera house and get on the set for the very first time. And up above, you'll see that we have a lighting and sound area. And this was actually the castle from Spamalot. And the space is now utilized also in the summer by the opera house for rehearsing their shows. And here's a picture of the workshop guys, Brian Helbut and Wayne Lennox. They've been invaluable to Matt. They've designed and built amazing sets for most of our productions over the past 20 years. And here they are on the left. They actually appeared on stage in two productions, Man of La Mancha and South Pacific. Here they are in Man of La Mancha. So in March of 2005, through the insistence of the director, Wayne Noble, rehearsals moved to the Matt Center. And we cleared enough space to set up the play and the orchestra led by Sud Sutherland. Now, there was no electricity in the building yet. No problem. Our kindly neighbors next door allowed us to run extension cords to the Matt building. And so amongst the drywall and the concrete dust, we rehearsed the musical Evita. And here's a picture of Amy Lee Patterson with our daughter, Emily Newton, who was the youngest member of the cast at the age of 8. And this picture we see here, Fred Larson in the center. He returned to Matt after 33 years. He played Juan Perron. And you see Andrew Bell, Jim Barnett, who was 80 years old at the time, did all the choreography, including having to do push-ups. Roger Luce and Mike Beresford. This was his first show with Matt, a former president with Mariposa Arts. Much Ado About Nothing was our very first venture into Shakespeare, and this was directed by Sally Holdsworth. And this, incidentally, was the last show that Ken Brown appeared in. Here over on the right, we see Candy Price as Beatrice and Kevin Scarf flying through the air as Benedict. Now, Sally did some gender switching in this. Leonato became Leonata, as acted by Janet Lynn Durnford, who is also one of our city councilors, along with Michael Clark as Dogberry and yours truly as Don Pedro. Other Shakespearean productions. During COVID, we held outdoors at the Leacock House, Twelfth Night, directed by Randy White, and The Complete Works of William Shakespeare Abridged, directed by Doug Ironside. On Golden Pond, we did in 2007, directed by Wayne Noble. This set an attendance record at the Studio Theater. All but the first night was sold out of the 8-performance run. And here you see a picture of Linda Lewis and Chuck Mugford, Sandy Edmonds, Wheezy Green, Candy Price. My Fair Lady. This was directed by Phyllis Johnson, and Blair Bailey was the musical director. Over on the left is a picture of how we used to have to move into the opera house with a hoist. Fortunately, in 2014, we've had the use of the new elevator. Now, over on the right is the costumes with Phil Hull and Valerie Thorne. Now, this is the first time we'd ever done My Fair Lady. The only time, one of the reasons was they were afraid of the cost of the costumes. Well, Rita Whiston developed a way of making hats in a fairly inexpensive manner. However, the hats were so good that an audience member was so taken by the hats that she contacted Rita in order to purchase one to wear to church. Now, in 2008, we did A Few Good Men. So in this case, we actually did get A Few Good Men. This was directed by Angela Mundy. And Amy Lee Patterson was the only female character in this particular show. Over on the right, you see a picture of The Last Resort, done in 2009, directed by Nikki Campbell. The musical director was Renee Cingolini. And the gentleman you see on the second from the right there is Darren Stephen, who starred in our production of Jekyll and Hyde. This was a musical by Norm Foster and Leslie Arden, and we've done several Norm Foster shows over the years, such as The Melville Boys Twice, On a First Name Basis, and The Affections of May. Sweeney Todd in 2010, directed by Valerie Thornton. This is a Sondheim musical, very difficult. Quote from another musical director, one of the most difficult musicals for a community theater group to do. And Katie Purgo was the musical director for this show. Over on the left is a picture of Michael Clark and Jake Thompson. Jake has gone on to a musical career in jazz. And it's also another example of the number of people involved in a production. 2011, we did Music Man Jr., directed by Krista Woodman. One of Matt's mandates is to support youth in theater, and several shows have had plenty of children and youth, and some have gone on to careers in the theater business. And since 1976, we've given bursaries to a graduate from each high school going into some kind of performing arts. Now, Phyllis Johnson and Linda Crawford. 2012, as I mentioned, Phyllis directed You Can't Take It With You. And this was recommended to us by Phil Hull. And this was the first show that completely sold out the studio theater for all 8 shows. And unfortunately, Phil passed away a day before the show opened. Now, Phyllis, she's been a member since 1987. She's directed, produced, acted, costumes, lighting, stage managed, board member, and has been in numerous productions. And she's also producing the 50th anniversary show. Linda Crawford, approximately 40 years in charge of ticket sales for Matt. First one was 1972 Sound of Music. You know, in the early days, she actually tended the box office 5 evenings a week, plus afternoons on Saturdays, ahead of every production. Matt paid for the telephone in those days at the Opera House as well. And she was on the board for several years. And sadly, she passed away in 2014. 2013, we dedicated the rehearsal hall in Phil's honor. And here his widow, Joanna Rowland, unveiling the plaque. 2013, we did The Rez Sisters, directed by Sandra Pym Carson, written by Thompson Highway. And to paraphrase the director's program notes, it's a story of 7 women on a reserve on Manitoulin Island, desperately trying to find ways to raise enough money to attend the biggest bingo in the world, while at the same time questioning the quality of their lives and how much they needed each other. The cast was a mix of First Nation and non-First Nation actors, some who had never been on stage before. And recently, in Aurelia, 4 members of the cast met Thompson Highway. He autographed one of the scripts, or all of their scripts, actually. And here's an example. And thank you to Stacy Schatt for sharing that picture. Inherit the Wind in 2004, directed by Bridget Gould. Look at the set design that was created by Alex Kasparowicz, our set painter extraordinaire. It's Aurelia's landscape. 2014, Spamalot, directed by Michael Clipperton. King Arthur, played by Scott Boyer, along with his various knights. A very clever bit from this show involved the audience being shown a video of Arthur and his knights entering the opera house, charging up the stairs to the entrance of the theater, and then in live action, the actors actually entered the theater to attack the castle. Very, very clever. Now, to commemorate 100 years since World War I, we did two Second World War related shows. The War Show on the left, directed by Ron Payne, and Waiting for the Parade in 2016, directed by James Fairbairn. We'd also done Waiting for the Parade in 1997. And I want to say that Linda Newton stage managed both of those Waiting for the Parade shows plus the War Show. Now, in 2015, through the efforts of Alex Kasparowicz and Jim Lewis, amongst others, approval was given by the city to allow audiences to attend the Matt Center for shows. So in 2015, 2 plays were presented. The Coffee Break, directed by Wayne Noble, and The Anniversary, written and directed by Jim Lewis. And this production was called 2 Plays and a Tart. You see, a tart was given out at intermission to members of the audience. And here you see a picture of Steve and Jim Lewis. And over on the right, we see a picture from 2016, the Melville Boys. It's an example of what can be presented at the Matt Center as seen by Alex Gasparowicz's work. Sesquicentennial year 2017, a joint effort between St. Paul's and Matt, was Aurelia is Born. This was a musical written by Jim Lewis, a fictionalized version of the beginnings of Aurelia that began in 1867 as well. This was directed by Phyllis Johnson, and the musical director was Blair Bailey. And this production was actually presented with an award by the city of Aurelia for its contributions to the sesquicentennial celebrations. That same year, we did Chicago, and again, a joint effort with the Opera House, directed by Wayne Noble. Christina Bosco was the musical director. The choreographer was Sherry Nichols. And I want to thank Deb Helbett for the photos for the next three productions. You know, this show should have been adjudicated. Unfortunately, it wasn't, because it's the best production that I've ever been a part of. So many outstanding performances, especially by Josh Helbett as Billy Flynn, who you see on the right with Janelle. It's significant. And also on the left, we see a picture of the Cell Block Tango and Christina Bosco leading the band above and behind the actors. There's a significant amount of time put into these types of shows. In fact, with this show, the auditions were held in June. Rehearsals began in early August, and they ran 3 times a week until we opened in November. Lots of work also behind the scenes with the props and the set building, the costumes, and the band rehearsals. The cost of musicals, it can be expensive. And in most cases, it runs anywhere from $25,000 to $30,000 with the rights, the Opera House rental, set materials, costumes, and honorariums. 2019, Urinetown, directed by Valerie Thornton. And over on the left, we have a picture of Natasha Paquin, who won an ACO Award for her performance. A year ago, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, directed by Caleb Sauvé, a cult classic, huge attendance numbers, completely sold out 3 shows at the full Opera House. And this past year, we did Blythe Spirit, directed by Doug Ironside, and The Queer Cabaret, directed by Stevie Baker. For the upcoming season, we have the 50 Plus show, 50th anniversary show in November, The Play That Goes Wrong, a comedy farce in February, and The Murder Mystery, the Canadian show. I'll be back before midnight in April. If there's anyone interested in joining the Matt family, please consider doing so. You can contact us through the Matt website. So there you have it, from our humble beginnings 53 years ago to where we are now. And here's to those who will carry the torch for the next 50 years under the leadership of our current president, Fran Gelder. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The amount of familiar faces in there was surprising, actually. I did not expect to know quite so many people, but I'm sure some of those in the audience as well experienced the same thing. So that was amazing. A couple plays that I remember seeing and loving as well. So I'd love to see in the chat what some folks remember seeing and what some of their favorite plays were as well. With that, we will open it up to any questions that folks may have. So like I said, the Q&A feature is at the bottom of your screen, and you're welcome to put your questions in there, and we will pose them to Chris so he can answer them for us. But to start things off, Chris, you've been in over 50 productions. What is your favorite play that you were a part of?
That I was on stage for?
Or behind the scenes?
Well, certainly Chicago was the most outstanding show I've ever been a part of. I stage managed that one and helped with the lighting and ran the lighting board for that show. But I think my favorite part was probably Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. I must say that. And, you know, there have been some other great, wonderful, memorable roles over the years as well. But that was the one that stands out the most.
Okay. We have a comment from Paul who says, a great walk through the years. As a new Aurelian with a big arts background, I was educated and inspired. Thanks, Chris. And thanks.
You're welcome, Paul. You're very welcome.
Mm-hmm. So film nights as well, you mentioned, those are returning soon?
Yes, they had one last week, and I think there's another one on the 27th. Usually they're Wednesdays.
Okay.
I saw something came out today about the next film on the 27th.
Okay. Very good.
Important part of Matt for sure.
Yeah. Well, for those in the audience, Chris was kind enough to share some of this history with me as I've been putting the exhibition together. And I've had such a wonderful time learning about the history of this, such an influential community group. So, it's been wonderful that you're so willing to share this history as well.
Oh, you're welcome.
Pauline says, thank you, Chris, for such a great walk through the history of Matt. It brought back so many good memories.
That might have been Polly Burns, who was in the original production in 1970.
Yeah,
Thank you, Polly.
Yeah, I'm sure we have some Matt alumni in the audience as well. Yeah. So, Chris, if you could see one play produced by Matt in the coming years, what would be the one that you would choose that hasn't been done?
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. I was talking to a young fellow the other night, and he suggested that maybe we do Jesus Christ Superstar.
Ooh.
Yeah, which would be pretty exciting.
Definitely.
I don't know if there's any parts for old guys, but hey, you never know.
We have Dave Graham, who I know was in some of your photos.
Yes.
So very much, Chris. I've enjoyed working with you on various shows over the years. We have Ruth, who says the next film is Little Richard, I Am Everything. Aurelia Galaxy Cinema, Wednesday, September 27th at 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Paul suggests, do come from away.
Do I come from away?
No, do the play Come From Away.
Oh, Come From Away. Oh, yeah, sure. That would be great too.
I second that.
Absolutely. I've seen that twice. It's a fabulous show. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, Chris, we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks to everybody who attended and for your comments. And thanks as well, of course, to you, Chris.